Glenn Ligon's thought-provoking works combine text, silkscreen painting, neon and video to explore themes of racism, sexuality, civil rights and identity. His first solo show in the UK at the Camden Arts Centre presents new works based on the plight of the Harlem Six and using footage of the comedian Richard Pryor. So your new series of silkscreen paintings are based on the composer Steve Reich's taped speech work, using the recorded voice of Daniel Hamm, who was one of the Harlem Six, describing how he had to puncture one of his bruises to prove to the police that he'd been beaten. So this work is seminal in its own right and has also since been used by various other artists, including the choreographer Anna Maria de Kiersmacher. So what made you want to work with this text and why now?
Well, a lot of my work is text-based, and a lot of the work has dealt with the idea of text or meaning, words, going to abstraction. And I've been a fan of Steve Reich's work for years, and this particular piece, Come Out, was a favorite, but I've never used music as a direct source for artworks. And I had a group of students come to the studio one day, and someone asked me what I was listening to, and I said, oh, I've been listening to this Steve Reich record again, called Come Out, and I played it for them, and I realized that Reich is using testimony from kids from a particular sort of point in American history. He's interested in the emotional quality of that voice, but the way he uses that speech turns that speech into a kind of abstraction. I realized, well, that's my work, you know? And so I started to think more about Reich and the idea of repetition and layering, but also about the case that he was asked to make this record for. So Reich was asked to contribute a piece to a benefit concert, and Come Out comes from him listening to the testimonies of these kids involved in the Harlem Six. So he was interested in a kind of response to this call for action, you know, and that's where the piece came from. And I thought that was a very interesting beginning for the piece, though often when the piece is talked about, nobody remembers that history, you know.
So you wanted to remind people of that history?
Well, I think, you know, the case has many kinds of echoes in the present. James Baldwin in 1966 wrote an essay about this case, and he talked about a police tactic in New York called stop and frisk. Well, we still have stop and frisk in New York. The new mayor, Bill de Blasio in New York, has made it a point to reduce the amount of people stopped under that program. But it's amazing to me that almost 50 years later, we're still debating police tactics around unreasonable seizes and searches, you know. So it has a lot of resonance given what's going on certainly in the UK, but I would say, I'm sorry, United States, but certainly in the UK too, given sort of recent events.
Yeah, no, we have this stop and search, which
Right.
is also an issue here.
Right,
So, yeah.
right.
You work with text a lot, as you've said. Do most of your texts come from something with political meaning?
No, they come from a variety of sources. Literature, mostly. In the early work, Jean Genet, James Baldwin, Zora Neale Hurston, Gertrude Stein. There's a whole series of paintings using the comedian Richard Pryor, so using routines from his comedy acts. So the sources are varied, you know. I would say maybe literature is a kind of touchstone for a lot of the work.
So you obviously read a lot.
Well, I read to read. I don't read for work, I just read to read, you know, and if things stay in the head long enough and seem interesting to develop into artworks, then I sort of dig in deeper, try to figure out how to materialize those words into this form.
How do you select the actual, so this is working with 4 words, 5 words, and in the other room you've got the neon with 2 words.
Right. Well, this text comes directly from the Reich, you know, from the Steve Reich. So this is the little bit of fragment that he settles on out of this larger testimony. And I thought, as a phrase, it was really interesting. And so I just used that fragment and made silk screens with the text on them, 2 different screens, one justified left and right and one left justified, and started to overlap them on the canvases. And so the sort of density of the surfaces and the appearance and disappearance of the text is from that overlapping. The neon in the other room is also based on Reich. When Daniel Hamm, whose testimony Reich takes, says, I had to open the bruise up to let some of the bruised blood come out to show them that he had been injured, he actually makes a slip of the tongue. He says, I had to open the bruise up to let the blues blood come out to show them. And I was interested in that slip between bruise and blues. Ralph Ellison once said that the blues was personal catastrophe expressed lyrically. So the idea of pain and sorrow and suffering gets transformed into this other language called blues, this kind of musical expression. But I think often the blues as a sort of genre of music is disassociated from the bruising part, you know? And so that slip of the tongue was really interesting to me, and the neon tries to, in some ways, materialize that gap between blues and bruise, you know, by making the words face away from each other and sort of abstracting them.
Can you tell us how you started working with neon? Because that's quite an interesting story.
I started working with neon because I had a studio in a building where there was a neon maker. And one day, after 3 years of walking by his shop and just waving hi, he said, well, when are you coming in for the tour? So I decided, okay, this is the day I'm coming in for the tour. And he was showing me various projects he's doing. He does commercial work, but also does work for artists. And just as a joke, I said, I make black and white text paintings, so what about black neon? And he said, black is the absence of light, but a point I had to concede. But he had done a project with Burberry's where he had to reproduce their stripe, their plaid, you know, for a window display made out of neon, and they have a black stripe in that plaid. And so the way he did that was to take a neon tube that was emitting white light and put a black line down the front of it. So it read as a black line, but it also read as neon. And I got really interested in that kind of idea of eclipsed light because so much it sort of fit with my work, you know. So that's where the neons started from. Yeah.
So you've mentioned Richard Pryor already. So your third work here is using footage from his 1982 live show, the Live on Sunset Strip.
Right. Richard Pryor was the person that my older cousins had albums of, and so we'd sneak up to their bedrooms and put him on really low so the parents couldn't hear. But I think what was interesting, or still is interesting to me about Richard Pryor is that his jokes aren't funny. They're jokes, but they're such sort of sharp critique of race relations, sexuality, Americans' relationship to history. So he was always a sort of touchdown for me. This project's a little different because I don't normally work in video. I've only done 1 or 2 other things in video. But I became really interested in thinking about Pryor because he's such a physical comic. You know, all of his routines involved this incredible kind of movement of his body. He's incredibly skillful at inhabiting characters, you know, creating a character right in front of you on stage and inhabiting that through the way he, you know, uses his gestures. And so I thought, in some ways, you don't need his text, you know. You don't need his words to understand something about him. But I was also really interested in what is left over when there's not language there, when there's not speaking. And so it's hard to know, you know, this piece is new, so I'm still processing what exactly it's about. But by focusing intensely on different parts of his body, I wanted the viewer to sort of think about how difficult it is to kind of grasp him, you know, both politically, if you know his routines, but also just as a persona. He was kind of a lot of different things, you know, and somehow the video, I think, is about that, trying to think about that. So you literally have to move around the space to see this video because it's on 7 different screens and at different parts of his body, and they're not all at the same time. So there's no narrative there. There's only flashes of his body, you know.
Talking about understanding the works, do you think, I mean, this is your first solo show at a public institution in the UK. Do you think the audience here will approach your work in a different way and with a different cultural imperative, and will that affect their understanding of the topics you're...
Certainly. I think any artwork, you know, changes by context. But I think that is the interesting thing about artwork for me, is that I don't make artworks with the idea that there's one meaning. That is the meaning that people should get when they look at it. I'm interested in it having a multiplicity of directions that a viewer can take from it. And also, I think that's the way I approach thinking about artwork too. I don't make work with ideas in mind, you know, that I solve by just presenting an artwork that's just an illustration of those ideas. I think I think through things by making the artworks, and so they were kind of a process of thinking, and maybe that process of thinking gets transmitted to the viewer.